So on the first day of my preaching class in seminary, the professor stood before us and said sternly, "The sermon is not about you. The sermon must always point to Jesus." Now, I don't remember for certain if she was wagging her finger at us, but I certainly got the message. And okay, fair enough. And yet, we also know that the sermons teach us quite a bit about our preachers. For example, we learned of Pastor Ellen. Remember, Pastor Ellen was an avid LSU fan, and she was from Louisiana and loved her gumbo. And then there was Pastor Marty, who grew up on a campsite in North Carolina and once was pulled over for driving the camp van at age 12. And when we learned that Pastor Michelle used to love wearing her fuzzy bunny slippers around the church office, that seemed quite natural for her. And we learned that Pastor Gitra used to organize and manage the National Symphony Orchestra. But far more importantly, just this very last week, we learned that Pastor Gitra is also a crazy bird lady. And then there's Pastor Will. Now, Pastor Will has this thing for Duke University. And that's because he went to Duke Divinity School. Now, all the rest of us, we go to seminary, but if you went to Duke, you went to divinity school. Now, I find that a little bit ironic, considering that their mascot is a devil. And it's not just Duke, mind you. I mean, just down the road from there is Wake Forest and their demon deacons. Now, I went to Wesley Seminary, and we only had good deacons. Well, anyway, I digress. So how do you know if your pastor went to Duke? Oh, don't worry, he'll let you know. I'm just kidding, of course. Truth be told, Pastor Will is one of the most humble people I know. And okay, so I think it's fair that you also learn a little bit about me as well, particularly that this might be the last sermon I'm invited to preach. Now, I grew up in a German home with a German mother who also was a very accomplished artist. And she primarily works in watercolors, but is also skilled in many other media as well. And it was always important to my mother to instill a little bit of culture in her children. But I just wasn't gifted artistically in that way. I even suffered through 7 years of piano lessons. And well, that didn't stick. And to be fair, I think my piano teacher suffered far more than I did. Now, as those of you who are mothers know, once you're a mother, you will always be a mother. And for those of you who have a mother know, she will never stop mothering you. And so it was just a few weeks ago, over the Christmas break, that I found myself in the East Wing of the National Gallery of Art with my mother, absorbing my semi-annual dose of culture. Think of it kind of like a COVID booster shot. A little dose can go a long way. Now, I like art, and so I admit it really wasn't all that bad. I quite enjoyed spending the day at the museum with my mom on this cold and rainy winter day. And we went someplace I hadn't been before. We were up in one of the tower rooms of the East Wing, and I found myself standing in front of a large white canvas with a thin vertical green line meticulously painted down one side. Now, one thing that I've learned about art is that it often reaches deep into the soul of the artist. And what appears on the canvas can reflect the deep emotional stirrings in the heart of the artist and the viewer. So I stood in front of this painting transfixed, and honestly a little bit stumped. What was the artist trying to convey? Perhaps the title that the artist had given this work would help. Something like Eternal Envy in the Siberian Wilderness, or Train Delay at Mount Vernon Square Station. So I looked at the little white plaque at the bottom of the painting next on the wall and was ready to read that evocative title that would make all things clear. And this is what it read: Green Line on white canvas. My soul was crushed. And so when the National Gallery announced that they would be accepting submissions for their perspectives on a pandemic exhibition, I thought to myself, how hard can it be? And so imagine with me for a moment, maybe close your eyes if that helps. You're walking into the American Masters Gallery. These large vaulted ceilings, and over to this side there's a Georgia O'Keeffe with her buffalo skull or whatever that is that she draws. And over here there's a Jackson Pollock, and we don't know what he draws. And my favorite, Edward Hopper and his Nighthawks. And then right in the middle of all those is my masterpiece. Now, before I present it to the National Gallery, I figured I would share it with you all, because you all were what really guided and supported me through the pandemic. So I wanted to share it with you first. But I do admit I'm a little bit nervous, because this painting means a lot to me, and I really do hope you like it. So, Geetra, if you're still talking to me, if you would help me uncover it. So, all right, we'll let the choir see it too. And tech team, maybe you could zoom in so that the online worshipers could get the sense of the rich colors and textures there. And it's going to have its own little plaque down here on the wall, and it's going to say Quarantine by Phil Moore, 2023, ink on melamine. From his brooding Centreville period. So, well, clearly, I'm not going to make it as an artist. And the jury's still out whether I'm going to make it as a preacher either. But this painting is about how I was feeling during the early days of the pandemic. There were days when I didn't want to get out of bed, when I just wanted to stick my head under the pillow, and when I pulled it back out again, everything would be back to normal. I'm sure you had those days as well. But as good as my painting is, I admit there is something wrong with it. You see, while this painting captures my emotions as good art should, I think there's a danger in dwelling there. We all know the saying, when the going gets tough, the what? Oh, come on. You're worse than my Ezra Bible study group. Let's try that again. When the going gets tough, very good. All right, much better. But how are you actually supposed to get going when the world is falling down around you? You see, the problem with my painting is that it's all about me. The answer starts by changing the narrative. It's precisely when the going gets tough that God calls us to be the salt and the light. And the point of salt and light is not that they exist for themselves. Have you ever eaten a bar of salt? Kind of like a granola bar, just one big stick of salt? Of course not. Salt isn't good that way. The value of salt is that it seasons other food and makes it taste better. You see, God always wants us to be salty, not for our own sakes, but for the sake of God's world. And light is the same way. When light is the focal point, all it does is attract moths and mosquitoes. No, the value of light is that it comes not in itself, but in what it offers when it casts out the darkness around it, when it illuminates and shines and points the way. Yes, God wants our lights to shine, not as a spotlight upon ourselves, but as a beacon, giving hope to others. The world around us needs hope, and we possess that hope. We know the light of the world. God has made us the salt of the earth, not by our own doing, but by God's grace, and by being surrounded and enfolded and embraced by God's love. We have something different to offer this world, something wonderful that makes life taste richer. And Jesus' message was not just to his disciples or to the devoted elite. No, he spoke these words on his Sermon on the Mount. This was his first major public sermon recorded in the Scriptures. And he cast his net wide to all who might hear. You don't need to be a super Christian to shine God's light. You don't need to sing solos or lead Bible studies or preach from the pulpit. You just need to love others first, as Jesus did. Imagine how different the world would look if all of us were salt and light to one another. So why does it feel like faith is so bland sometimes? Why does church feel so bland sometimes? Perhaps it's because our salt has lost its saltiness. Are we just going through the motions? Are we really just in it for ourselves? Is our righteousness just an act we put on for others or for God? You know, one of the most frequent complaints people have about the church today is that we're just a bunch of hypocrites. We demand purity, but offer so much less ourselves. Our denomination is in turmoil as Christians judge one another and the world around them. I don't think that's at all what Jesus had in mind. Remember those Beatitudes from last week? Blessed are the haughty, because we know better than you. Blessed are the self-righteous, because we have this holiness thing all figured out. Blessed are the self-absorbed, because it's really all about me anyway. The prophet Isaiah has something to say about that in our Old Testament lesson today. Now, this section of Isaiah, which is sometimes referred to as 3rd Isaiah, was written in the post-exilic period after the Israelites had returned from their exile in Babylon. It points to God's servant, who we now understand to be Jesus, and to God's servants, who we now understand to be us. So how do we, as servants, reflect the servant? Well, that's what the people of Isaiah's day were asking as well. Look, we're fasting. We're going to church. We're following all the rules. God, why aren't you taking heed? And here's God's answer. You serve your own interests on your fast day and oppress your workers. You fast only to quarrel and to fight and to strike with wicked fists. Boy, doesn't that sound like our denomination in our national political climate today? And God goes on, such worship will not make your voice heard on high. Instead, God says, is not this the fast I choose? To loose the bonds of injustice, to undo the thongs of the yoke, to let the oppressed go free and break every yoke? Is it not to share your bread with the hungry and bring the homeless poor into your house? When you see the naked, cover them, and not to hide yourself from your own kin? Then your light will break forth like the dawn. You know, I have little stomach for the shouting matches in our denomination and in our political sphere today, because I can guarantee that the people at the parking lot of the Home Depot, where our Hot Meals team pulls in to feed them, they don't care. They need to see an Isaiah 58 church, not a hypocritical, self-absorbed church. They need to see a serving church, not a judging church. They need to see a loving church, a caring church, a feeding church. That salt will never go stale. So what about you? How salty are you feeling today? Maybe it's time to turn off Fox News or MSNBC for a while. Get away from the anger and the vitriol and sign up to serve food at our library food distributions, or hug a confirmand, or support our youth and kids' homeless ministry. Send an encouraging note to a struggling teacher or a friend or neighbor. A few months ago, I was asked to preach at the Lamb Center, which is a day shelter for the unhoused in Fairfax Circle. On my way there, I must have passed at least a dozen churches, all different denominations. And I couldn't help but think to myself, if every one of these churches and all those within their doors were living Isaiah 58, oh, how different our world would be. Maybe we wouldn't even need a Lamb Center. You know what I learned during the pandemic? I've been surrounded by scores of volunteers over the past 3 years, and hundreds more who supported financially and through donations of food. And the view from above my pillow, well, it looked like a new dawn would be coming after all. You see, this pandemic has brought out the very best in Christians who saw a need and never unsaw it, who have given sacrificially of their time, their energy, their money, and their muscles for the sake of someone else. Yes, there has been great suffering. There has been great pain and loss and loneliness and isolation. Yes, the pandemic has stolen something from all of us. And yes, there is a time to mourn, and to mourn just as long as you need to. And that's different for everyone. There's a time to grieve, and there's a place for fear, and for self-doubt, and even for self-pity. There are times to look within. But yes, there is also a time to be the light again. Healing begins when we can turn the why me into the what next, God. Or as Isaiah puts it, then your light will begin to break forth like the dawn. Your healing shall spring up quickly, your vindicator shall go before you, and the glory of the Lord shall be your rear guard. And then you shall call, and the Lord will answer. You shall cry for help, and he will say, Here am I. When the going gets tough, be the light. When the going gets tough, be salty. When you feel like an ostrich and you want to bury your head in the sand, say it with me. Be salty. You didn't say it with me. Say it with me. When you want to bury your head in the sand, be salty. Amen.